Keith Krach, the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment, called on the Chinese Communist Party to tear down the Great Firewall. Also, the Vatican wants to extend its agreement with the CCP on recognizing the regime's bishops, which is set to end on October 22nd. I'll be going in depth into this. And China has a, quote, shared values problem, and this is one of its main weaknesses. Miles Yu, a policy advisor to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, made an important point on the difference between the United States and China in terms of this. I'll be explaining this more. Welcome back, everyone. First off, some breaking news. Now, in Berlin, Keith Krach, the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, Energy, and the Environment for the United States, called on the Chinese Communist Party to tear down the Great Firewall.
The Berlin Wall is gone, but a new digital wall has emerged. The Great Firewall of China. The Great Firewall of China separates the Chinese people from the free world, just as the Berlin Wall separated the German people from each other. Over 30 years ago, the Berlin Wall came crashing down. So to borrow the words of President Reagan, Mr. Xi, tear down China's Great Firewall.
Now, the Chinese regime's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Director General Hua Chunying, responded, saying that comparing the Berlin Wall to the Great Firewall is a, quote, silly analogy, and then accused the United States of holding a, quote, Cold War mentality. Around the same time, however, after the Chinese Communist Party had arrested recently a creator of Baidu, which is like the country's Google replacement, it began scrubbing this individual from the internet, erasing their history. Now, Shi Youcai, who is part of Baidu's startup team and also a special advisor to the company's mobile group, was recently arrested by Chinese authorities under accusations that he was illegally promoting overseas gambling websites. Now, when it comes to the Berlin Wall and the Chinese Communist Party's Great Firewall, they serve the same purpose but in different regards. The Berlin Wall was to prevent people from escaping from Germany into the free world. The Great Firewall is to prevent the Chinese people from accessing free information from the rest of the world. The Berlin Wall was a physical barrier. The Great Firewall in China is an ideological barrier. These are very similar but in different regards. Now, in Hong Kong, meanwhile, police surrounded and cordoned off a part of the metro station where a high school student was sitting and reading a copy of the pro-democracy newspaper Apple Daily. He was allegedly told that his actions, quote, affect other passengers. He was reading a newspaper. The student is Davis, who is known for holding one-man protests, and he's allegedly targeted and surrounded by Hong Kong police fairly frequently. Now, what are we seeing here? Hong Kong is supposed to have freedom of the press. So as part of the agreement with China and the UK when it handed off Hong Kong as a territory of the UK to the Chinese Communist Party. Hong Kong is supposed to have 50 years of relative independence from the Chinese Communist Party. It's supposed to have one country, two systems. That includes protections on the free press. Why is a student reading a newspaper being cordoned off and surrounded by police? Now, again, as I always mention, when it comes to the CCP's actions of censorship, why would they censor this? Why would a student reading a newspaper in a subway station be considered controversial? It's because the Chinese Communist Party wants to maintain ideological control, and even the slightest move against that they see as a threat to their power. Why would they feel that way? Why would they be afraid of people absorbing information that goes against their narratives? If you were to ask me, I'd say this is because they are afraid when it comes to ideology, because they are ideologically brittle. They're afraid of people accessing free information from outside of China. Now, in other news, the Vatican wants to extend its agreements with the Chinese Communist Party on recognizing the regime's bishops. That agreement set to end on October 22nd. Now, according to Vatican News, Cardinal Secretary of State Pietro Parolin said, quote, "It seems to me that a direction has been marked out that is worth continuing. Then we will see." Now, the Holy See and the Chinese regime published a joint communication on September 22nd, and they announced a provisional agreement that Vatican News says is aimed to, quote, permit the Catholic faithful to have bishops in full communion with the successor of Peter, who are at the same time recognized by the authorities of the People's Republic of China. Now, in China, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, has its own altered versions of many religions, including Christianity and Catholicism. There's, for example, the China Buddha Association. That's their state-run version of Buddhism. They have the same bodies for other religions. And state regulatory bodies that manage these as well are the ones in charge of these religions, the CCP's versions of them. Anyone who follows the religions but does not recognize the CCP's altered versions of them faces persecution. And it's for this reason that there were two sets of bishops in China. There's the group of the, quote, real bishops, generally recognized as not following the CCP's altered version, again, of their religion. And there's another that was appointed by the Chinese Communist Party itself, but was not previously recognized by the Vatican. This agreement between the Vatican and the CCP recognized the CCP's appointed bishops. Now again, the Vatican agreement changed this previous system, where again there were these real bishops who did not follow the CCP's altered version of the religion. This move, however, was criticized by human rights watchers and by China's house Christian community as a move that could bring additional crackdowns and additional persecution onto them, and it did seem to have that effect. Now, in light of this, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo urged the Vatican on September 30th to condemn the Chinese Communist Party's violations of religious freedom.
Nowhere, however, nowhere is religious freedom under assault more than it is inside of China today. That's because, as with all communist regimes, the Chinese Communist Party deems itself the ultimate moral authority. An increasingly repressive CCP, frightened by its own lack of democratic legitimacy, works day and night to snuff out the lamp of freedom, especially religious freedom, on a horrifying scale. I spoke on this topic last year for a bit, and I paid special attention last year to the Uyghur Muslims of Xinjiang. But they're not the only victims. The Chinese Communist Party has battered every religious community in China: Protestant house churches, Tibetan Buddhists, Falun Gong devotees, and more.
And said the Catholic Church should be at the forefront of demanding human rights in China. Now, Pompeo said, according to AP, quote, "We must support those demanding freedom in our time." And he added that when it comes to being a church permanently in a state of mission, as Pope Francis has said, quote, "Surely one of them is to be a church permanently in defense of basic human rights." Now, Pompeo had arrived in Rome on September 29th, and Pope Francis refused to meet with him. Just prior to this, on September 19th, Pompeo wrote on Twitter that despite the Vatican's deal with the CCP, quote, "The CCP's abuse of the faithful has only gotten worse. The Vatican endangers its moral authority should it renew the deal." Now, what are we seeing here? As we mentioned in previous episodes, the Chinese Communist Party right now, as we speak, is persecuting Christians and Catholics in China, actually regardless of whether they're following the CCP's version of the religion or the unaltered version of it. They're destroying churches, they're destroying temples, they're persecuting individuals who dare practice their beliefs. Also, there's the deeper controversy around Pope Francis. He's part of the Liberation Theology School of Catholicism. This was a school of Catholicism that framed Jesus as basically a communist revolutionary. This is a controversial branch of Catholicism that was not previously really recognized as an official branch of it, because again, it merges Catholicism with communist ideology. You might remember in the previous popes, if you were a communist, you could be excommunicated by the Catholic Church. And these moves have actually caused a break within the Catholic Church itself. There's a separate branch of the Catholic Church that does not recognize the current pope because of this. In the United States, meanwhile, the Trump administration has joined with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to launch a new campaign to combat child exploitation and child trafficking. A White House statement said the Trump administration officials, including Attorney General William Barr and White House advisor Ivanka Trump, will represent the Trump administration in a webinar and support its new, quote, safety pledge initiative for education and awareness of child exploitation. According to the Epoch Times, the White House officials stated, quote, "It is essential that we work together to keep children safe online and out of the vicious cycle of trafficking and abuse." Now, in other news, with the CCP virus, the Trump administration announced it will ship 150 million test kits in a new nationwide push to reopen schools and economies. And also, there's ongoing debate on another stimulus to help the country weather the virus lockdowns. Democrats introduced a revised stimulus bill on September 28th that would give an extra $600 a week in unemployment benefits, which includes the $1,200 stimulus checks and also $500 for dependents. There's been a back and forth with trying to pass a stimulus. And also in some other news, when it comes to the investigations into Crossfire hurricane, where the investigators in the Trump-Russia investigations are now themselves being investigated. There have been several new updates on this. FBI agent William Barnett told government investigators that agents who worked on the team of former special counsel Robert Mueller joked about wiping their cell phones. This follows news that the Mueller team wiped data on more than 24 phones before handing them over to investigators. Now, in addition to this, documents released by Attorney General William Barr have revealed that a key source in the dossier, used in part to launch the investigations against Trump, came from a Washington-based Russian national who supplied the information to former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele, and who in turn never verified most of the claims. Now, that dossier was spread among all the different media and among government officials and caused all these different rumors about Trump-Russia collusion. And this is raising concerns now that the dossier that was mostly unproven by this point, that created all these concerns over Russian disinformation and spread all these rumors about Trump working with Russia and impacting the elections as well, was itself Russian disinformation. The document that started this whole thing came from a Russian national. And it has also now been revealed in a letter by Director of National Intelligence John Ratcliffe that the then CIA Director John Brennan briefed President Barack Obama in late 2016 about Russian intelligence, alleging that then Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton was planning to create a scandal about Donald Trump by trying to tie him to the breach of the Democratic National Committee's systems, which Russia was accused of. At the United Nations this year, the conflict between the United States and China has become front and center. Now, we covered some of the back and forth between President Donald Trump and CCP leader Xi Jinping, but other statements were also significant and could also give us some hints at where things are heading. Now, Miles Yu, a policy advisor to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who is originally from China and has recently become a target by the CCP for personal attacks, made an important point on the difference between the United States and China. And he also highlighted one of the CCP's main weaknesses. One of the foundations in forming international alliances is shared values. And this is something the CCP lacks with any country in any meaningful way. Now, you spoke during a September 22nd online discussion about Hong Kong, which was hosted by Canada-based think tank MacDonald Laurier Institute. Now, he explained that China is more isolated than the world may think, and that the United States and other countries are more united against the CCP than it may realize. You said when it comes to multilateralism, there is always some kind of base in values, and they have to look at shared values between different countries. He said this is the basis of multilateralism. When you look at the United States, it has shared values with Austria, Japan, Australia, the UK, Canada, EU, some parts of NATO, some parts of the ASEAN countries. Now, the difference between the United States and China is the CCP does not have this same alliance. It does not have the same ideological alliance with its so-called allies.
We always keep in mind, to echo what Lord Patton has just said, China has none that it can be trusted as a really true ally to share its value. North Korea is useless for the PRC for most part. Russia is playing hard to get a game with Beijing. So China is more isolated. So it's very ironic yesterday to hear Xi Jinping at the UN to talk about China being a champion of multilateralism. That is a complete reflection of lack of self-awareness.
Now, what exactly did Xi Jinping mean when he talked about multilateralism? When it comes to the CCP's language, the reference to this is different than how the US would use it. The term in China is often just a veiled reference to its United Front work. Now, these operations are carried out by a Chinese government department sharing the same name, the United Front Work Department, and works by subverting the elite in each targeted country, including the United States, including, say, Canada, the UK, Australia, different parts of Europe, you name it. Every country they do this. And when they go to these countries, they again target the elite. These are the business leaders, the academics, the journalists, the politicians, and the key decision makers and influencers in that targeted society. The CCP looks to dominate the top levels of the society. Now, you noted that the concept of the United Front was touted by former CCP chairman Mao Zedong as one of the three so-called magic weapons, those are Mao Zedong's words, of the communist regime, with the other two being armed struggle and party building. Now, you also noted that in Hong Kong, for example, the United Front was the CCP's main tool in controlling the territory.
United Front, in this case, basically it's a top-down elite capturing approach. You basically capture the elites of Hong Kong, the socially reputables, the billionaires, as if they control the elite, and Hong Kong will be stable to the Communist Party's liking. And the people at the bottom, the mass majority of people in Hong Kong, do not really matter very little, or symbolic only.
Yet the Hong Kong protests showed that this approach does not work. You noted that the main hymn in Hong Kong was a song from Les Miserables, "Do You Hear the People Sing?" It was compared to a repeat of the student protests in Tiananmen in China for democracy all over again. And this was deeply significant symbolically for the rule and authority of the Chinese Communist Party.
This is basically the proof that the CCP's model of governance by capturing the elite to rule Hong Kong has failed.
Now, what took place in Hong Kong ties into the broader crisis the Chinese Communist Party is now facing. It's now realizing that just controlling the top-level institutions, controlling the main influencers, influencing the main levers of a society through corruption, through threats, and through personal interest, does not equal true influence. Its approaches are unable to capture the broader social consciousness. It cannot get the grassroots social consciousness. And this has resulted in the CCP's disjointed system, its disjointed form of government that depends on totalitarian rule to maintain the semblance of order. You noted that Hong Kong has acted as a testing ground for the CCP's credibility and is now showing its failing form of government. The entire world has now witnessed how the CCP's agreement with the free world has fallen apart.
Hong Kong, in my view, is a grand experiment that has failed miserably. People would not be united under a totalitarian regime. So nationalistic pride cannot take the place of liberty and individual freedom.
And on an even deeper level than this, you noted that what happened in Hong Kong sent a message to the world that the Chinese Communist Party cannot be trusted. When the CCP abandoned its agreement to keep Hong Kong free under a policy of one country, two systems, it demonstrated its lack of credibility. You noted this agreement and how it fell apart right in front of the world. It was a promise, he said, of a high degree of autonomy that was supposed to last for 50 years, and Hong Kong was supposed to have judicial independence, free press, individual liberty, rule of law. You said this promise was made, this promise has been broken. And he said you might say it's even been broken on a very brutal, semi-fascist way, in his words.
So the Hong Kong abomination, as we say it now, proved that CCP cannot be trusted. And this should be a huge reputational cost to the CCP, because a country without credibility cannot be the leader of the world.
As things now stand, the world has quietly united against the Chinese Communist Party, and the voices of opposition are becoming louder. Now, the full picture of this hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention, but we can see different countries standing up against the CCP and also uniting with each other under the same messages. You noted this has been a heavy focus for U.S. diplomacy, and the results of this are now beginning to show. He said just about every liberal democracy in the world is now recognizing the Chinese Communist Party as a threat.
Just about every liberal democracy in the world recognizes China is a threat. We have been urging our friends and allies all over the world to build an alliance of democracies to counter the China threat.
Now, what are we really seeing here? The Chinese Communist Party, the China model, represents a different form of government than the U.S. model. For the Chinese Communist Party, it has maintained power through totalitarian dictatorship. It controls every single facet of the society. And its argument for this is how can you have social stability if you have so many people in your country without totalitarianism? The United States, on the other hand, while it's criticized up and down, it still represents this idea that if people are given basic rights, basic liberties, that they can create a free and prosperous society. The idea is freedom versus socialism. The Chinese Communist Party represents the idea of state-controlled businesses, state-controlled everything. The state controls your life, monitors every purchase you make online, monitors everything you do, and even tries to monitor your beliefs and your opinions. And the United States, on the other hand, is built on the idea of individual liberty, the idea that you can make your own decisions, you can choose between right and wrong, you have the freedom to fail, and you have the opportunity to succeed if you push yourself. These are two completely different systems. And also this represents something else, which is top-down versus bottom-up control. When you're dealing with totalitarian regimes, one of the reasons the Chinese Communist Party persecutes religion, one of the reasons it has destroyed the traditional Chinese culture, is it does not want people to have a basis of morality that could oppose the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. They have what they call political correctness, which is used differently in China than the United States. This was 1967 Mao Zedong, and the idea is simple, similar to the United States in this regard. It's the idea of a political, moral system. What the government says is what is moral. If you support it, you are politically correct. If you go against it, you are not politically correct. If you go against it, you can be persecuted, you can be defamed, you can have your reputation destroyed. For the CCP, whatever it does, any action it takes is supposed to be the moral stance. And if people have a higher belief, if they believe in a higher power than the Communist Party elites, it means that they have a system of morals through which they can judge whether what they're doing is right or wrong and good or evil. And the Chinese Communist Party tries to crush that. They try to oppose it. But the reality the Chinese Communist Party is now facing is that when you destroy the basis of social stability on the grassroots level, you destabilize the country to the extent that you can only maintain stability to the degree that you can monitor people and control people. This is why they have the social credit system and this artificial, karma-based system where you're rewarded for doing things that benefit the country and punished if you do things that go against it or the Chinese Communist Party. And the CCP is seeing something else, which is that threats and coercion do not equal true control. People still oppose it. The more it threatens them, the more it coerces them, the more it tries to force them through power from above, the more they stand up against it and the more they oppose the regime. And again, this ties to something else, which is value alignment and multilateralism. The difference between the United States and China when it comes to multilateralism. The US model is finding shared values. It's aligning when it comes to shared interests, when it comes to, say, cooperation on manufacturing, when it comes to equal deals as much as possible. The United States looks to build alliances like this, oftentimes to the extent it loses out on a lot of its trade deals. The Chinese Communist Party is the opposite, though. When it looks at multilateralism, its tools are bribery, corruption, and personal interest. It does not mind getting countries locked into debt traps. It does not mind ripping them off. It does not mind spreading corruption within their political systems. These systems are totally opposite when it comes to how international order is formed. And we now see the China model is failing. Now, with that said, folks, again, we're broadcasting 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. As always, if you want to support us, please consider joining us on Patreon. You can find the link to that in the description below. If you haven't already also, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps this channel grow. If you want to go the extra mile, you can tell a friend or family member about Crossroads, and also consider sharing this video. Now, with that said, please take care of yourselves, stay healthy, and stay free.